Welcome everyone back to your favorite topic, oil, Russian oil. But this time we're not going to take a look at oil refineries being bombed. We're going to be taking a look at oil export terminals being bombed across Russia. How is that Ukrainian campaign doing and why is it important? Well, let's get into exactly what triggered me to take a deeper look at the Russian oil export terminal market. And that is due to a podcast which I listened to. It's from the Decoding Geopolitics podcast on YouTube, where a Lieutenant General Ben Hodges made a statement which triggered me and made me want to take a deeper look at it. He essentially said, even if oil refineries are hit, Russia can continue to generate revenue as long as it can ship out crude oil through export infrastructure. Therefore, disrupting export terminals is strategically more impactful because it directly reduces Russia's capacity to sell oil globally and thus to finance its military action. And in that statement, he makes a really good point, and I wanted to explore that statement deeper. So what we're going to be looking at in this video specifically is that entire oil value chain, the Russian oil value chain. Where does it start and where does it end? What goes to export? What goes domestically? We're going to be analyzing what are the bottlenecks in that value chain. We're going to be looking at what is the oil refinery bombing campaign having an impact on that value chain, and what is the bombing campaign on the oil export terminals having as an impact on that value chain. And then to sum it all up, we're going to be looking at current news, what that current news has as an impact on the results from that oil value chain. And we're also going to be mapping out, obviously, as always, those oil export terminals on the map of Russia and identify which ones have been hit and what percentage of capacity might therefore have been taken out or potentially been taken out. So bear with me and let's jump right in. So this is the image that we're going to be using as a basis for the whole value chain in this video. And we looked at a Bruegel study from 2021 to take a look at what happens to Russian crude oil. It gets pumped out of oil wells, and then 24% of that crude oil gets sent straight to export terminals to China and to India and or to the rest of the world. Back in 2021, also to a lot to Europe. This happens through infrastructure such as shipping infrastructure and through pipelines. And we're going to be looking more at the shipping export terminal infrastructure. So 24% goes straight for export, 76% goes to Russian oil refineries. From that 76%, it all gets refined into diesel, gasoline, and other oil-related products. And then 48% of the total 100% goes for domestic use. So 48% is used domestically within Russia. And 28% is again exported to international markets such as China and India, right? So of the total, we can say that there's a pretty clear 50-50 split based on the Bruegel study between oil that gets consumed, that gets refined and consumed immediately domestically, and oil that is either sold immediately as crude to the export market or refined and then sold to the export market at a premium above crude oil, right? Because when you refine a product, it can get sold at a premium. So let's take a look at what happens when we apply the Ukrainian oil refinery kinetic sanctions on the Russian oil refineries on top of the value chain, right? And we know that from my last video that 4 to 10% of the annual Russian refining capacity has been taken out in the 2025 bombing run. Bearing in mind that that bombing run has only been running for 3 months, it still managed to take out 4 to 10% of the yearly volume. And what they're trying to do here is take out a bottleneck in the value chain. And speaking of bottlenecks, we have to identify what are the actual bottlenecks in this value chain. Number one, we have the oil wells where the oil gets pumped out from across Russia, etc. Number two, the oil refineries. We've talked a lot about the oil refineries. These are highly complex chemical plants where the crude oil is sent and then processed into diesel, gasoline, and other oil-related products. Number 3, the export terminals are also a bottleneck. Before you can export, you need to put it in these export terminals, in particular when you want to do seaborne exports, right? Because the seaborne exports, you need to bring the oil or the crude oil or the processed oils near the coast and then send it onto the tankers before you can send it off. Number 4 looks at the infrastructure for export itself, and these are pipelines and tankers. There's many tankers. There's a Russian shadow fleet, for example, exporting that crude oil or refined oils across the world. But there's also pipelines. Pipelines do not need export terminals. Pipelines just pipe the petrol straight wherever they need to go. And then finally, we have the 5th bottleneck, which is actually know-how, parts, and inputs. And what I mean by this is during the oil refining bombing campaign, we know that the parts that have been taken out due to an explosion need to be replaced. Are those parts easily replaceable? Is the know-how there even at all in order to repair it? And this know-how, these parts and these inputs are not just specific for refineries, they're also applicable to all of the various bottlenecks. For example, is the know-how there to repair an oil well? Is the know-how there to report an export terminal, etc.? These are the 5 bottlenecks which I've identified in the Russian oil value chain. But now let's together quantify the value in the sense of the value as a target of each of these bottlenecks. And we can basically say that some bottlenecks are more equal than others. So my evaluation of the oil well as a bottleneck to strike is very low. I put it as green as the lowest one entirely because there's just too many oil wells. They're spread out across Russia in hard to reach parts, and they will anyways shut down if you destroy the upstream value chain. And I'll explain how that works later in this video. Number 2, completely red oil refineries. There's few of them. They're high value, high tech, hard to repair, and all of them are, or the majority of them are close to Ukraine. So these are an excellent target, and they process 75% of all Russian oil, right? Or 76 if you want to be exact, of Russian oil. And that also explains why Ukraine has focused so much on this bottleneck, because this is the type of calculation they will have made themselves. Then number 3, the export terminals I've evaluated as orange or dark brown, whatever color you want to call that. There's few of them. They're also high value. They're mid-tech in terms of technology. So refineries are far more high-tech than export terminals. And they're mid-tier in terms of repair. So they're easier to repair than oil refineries. However, they're the bottleneck for the majority of oil revenues. In that sense, they are an excellent target. What do I mean by that? We said in the beginning of the video, 50% of the Russian oil goes for domestic use and 50% goes to export, whether it's refined or crude oil. And that means that all of this oil has to either go through pipelines or through export terminals, which then goes into the shadow fleet and the tankers. And as such, that means that almost half of Russian revenues from oil, or the majority, because presumably it also sells at a premium for the Russians when it's exported as opposed to used domestically, all of those revenues are generated thanks to this piece of infrastructure. Then, looking at number 4, the actual infrastructure of export, which are tankers and pipelines. And specifically looking at tankers first, there's way too many tankers. They're spread out across the globe. They're hard to track. They're low value. They're just tankers. They cannot be stopped unless you have a lot of help from your allies. So Ukraine on its own cannot stop Russia from using tankers. The tankers come from every single part across the Arctic Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, the Sea of Japan, etc. There's so many ways that they can reach Russia that Ukraine cannot stop. And then finally, pipelines. These are essentially unstoppable, at least from what I've read. so far in the Ukraine war. Sometimes these pipelines get hit, but as far as I can read, they're very easy or relatively easy to repair. So that's not such a great target. But sanctions are helping. So sanctions are helping at blocking both tankers and pipelines from actually being utilized. So that is an area where EU and US sanctions are helping a lot. And that is why I put them as yellow, right? And then finally, also as yellow, number 5, know-how, parts, and inputs. These are again too many, they're spread out, low value, and cannot be stopped unless with help from allies. So again here, they're marked as yellow because you can do something, but you do need the help from allies. The sanctions need to work. And so from this evaluation, the main conclusion are number 1 main target has to be the refineries, but number 2 is actually the export terminals. And I will also explain to you why that sequentialism is also important mathematically right now. So having identified that number 1 bottleneck, the oil refineries, let's take a look at what the Ukrainian campaign had as an impact on that oil value chain. And let's take a look at the campaign over a shorter period of time, assuming only a campaign on the refineries, right? And so we know the annual percentage of reduction, but let's rather look at the October percentage of reduction. And based on my previous video, we know that 29% of the Russian oil refinery capacity had been hit in the past 2 months, dated backwards from when I made the video and when I did my analysis, and that let's just assume that that 29% is out of production. And we know also that those 29% that are out of action are actually all highly localized in the West, while the center and the east of Russia are less affected. So 80% of oil refining capacity is actually in Western Russia, 20% is in the center and eastern parts of Russia, based on my previous video. We know this. So knowing that 29% is out of action in October, very localized time frame here in this little analysis, we know that that 29% translated on the 76%, which goes to the refineries, to the oil refineries, is equals to 22% of the total oil. And we know that 80% of that is in the West. So 80% of 22% is 18%. So we're going to see a reduction of 18% in the export terminals of the refined oil sent to the export terminals. So that goes down from 28% to 10%, because the assumption is also that the reduction is heavily taken up by the export terminals and less by domestic use, because Russia is going to prioritize the domestic use of oil as opposed over the exporting of refined oil. But it cannot completely prioritize it because the bombing is highly localized, right? So the export terminals in the Far East are still functioning as normal. So that's why I've applied an 80-20 percentage here, where 18% is taken off from the export terminal and only 4% is down from domestic use. So we see here a very, very heavy reduction in what can be exported from Russia in terms of diesel and gasoline, so refined products, and a small 4% reduction in terms of domestic use. But there is a delta there which needs to be compensated somehow, because now suddenly the Russians do not have enough diesel and or gasoline to do their daily lives as they used to. So what happens to all of that oil that got blocked previously? That 22% of oil which was blocked due to the oil refineries not being able to process it. Well, follow that green arrow. It goes away from the refineries, it goes down, and it goes straight to the export terminals now, because it has nowhere else to go. It's getting pumped regardless. It has nowhere else to go, and it goes straight to the export terminals. And there you see that yellow percentage goes from 24% to 48%. And so that's 100% increase in crude exports. And that crude export goes straight to China, India, and the rest of the world, sold at a discount, because we know that Russia is Russian oil is sanctioned, there's a price cap. So it's sold at a discount to China and India. There is less refined Russian oil sold to China and India, which can be sold at a premium, but still discounted. And what happens in the end is that crude oil, which Russia sells to China and India, in that green arrow, China and India then refine this Russian oil and sell it back to Russia, that 4% delta, which Russia is not able to service its domestic market with. It sells it back to Russia at market prices. So there is no discount for refined oil sold back to Russia by China and India. So this is a great trade for China and India. They get very, very cheap Urals priced oil from Russia, and they get to re-export that same oil post-processing back to Russia, because now Russia does no longer have the capacity to refine the oil for its domestic market. And so Russia is forced to buy its own oil back from the people that bought its crude oil. So it buys the diesel and the gasoline from the people to whom it sold it at a massive discount, and it buys it at market prices. So let's go through all of that again sequentially, what the consequences were of a best case scenario if Ukraine only bombs oil refineries, what happens down the value chain. So first of all, Russia exports less high value refined oil. Again, refined oil has a higher value than crude oil. And so many regions impose export bans. This is high value oil, but still at a discounted price. So we see an 18% loss of high value refined oil, which is still at a discounted price. This is a net negative for Russia. But then we have a net positive. That oil gets redirected, and Russia redirects that crude oil away from the refineries, since there is no longer any refining capacity, and send it straight to the export markets through its export terminals, again at a discount price. So this crude oil, which is discounted, there's a 22% increase in terms of crude oil directly exported to the export market. That's a positive thing for Russia, because it can still sell that oil. And that is what the General Ben Hodges meant. It can still export the oil. But then we have a number 3, another negative consequence. Russia must compensate for lack of domestic refined oil by importing Chinese and Indian refined oil at market price, because this is not discounted. There is no sanction or price cap on Chinese and Indian oil, and they're not going to sell it back to Russia at a discounted price. Why would they? So here we see that Russia has to pay 4%. 4% of the total oil that was in the value chain has to be re-imported at market prices. And this is refined oil, so high value oil. And then finally, the fourth negative consequence, sequential consequence of this, is Russia must repair refineries with expensive sanctioned spare parts and know-how, and all the additional costs that are related to this. This is that other bottleneck, number 5, which I identified, but this is also, again, expensive, these import parts. And so what we see overall, that the Ukrainian oil refinery campaign has a clear net negative monetary effect, despite massively increasing crude exports. So yes, Russia can export all of the oil which it can no longer refine straight to the export market and earn a lot of money off of that, but it cannot compensate the losses from not being able to refine it itself. But then let's ask ourselves the question, who actually says Russia is suddenly able to export 100% more crude oil than before the war? The new bottleneck is no longer the refinery. The new bottleneck is now the export terminal, because Russia is rerouting all of that oil away from the refineries and to the export terminals. But who says that it can handle that capacity? And so this is why I think Ukraine has shifted from targeting oil refineries and has started targeting oil export terminals as well. And so this is what we're going to be exploring in this video. So we had to look at the whole value chain in order to identify what the new bottleneck is. And that new bottleneck is definitely the export terminals. So what I did is I did a lot of research and I found some really good websites. One of them was Fleet Leaks. Fleet Leaks maps out Russian oil and gas terminals. It's an interactive map and it's an infrastructure database. And so you can see here, I've screenshotted it inside, and it has 43 terminals, which it has identified. It categorizes these by how large they are, so what volume they process. It looks at the calls that they've had, but it also categorizes the types of products that they export. And so what I did is I took that categorization and I evaluated the relevance of each terminal, right? Because it has 43 terminals, but are all of these terminals relevant for my study? Because some of these are gas terminals, some of these are exporting non-crude oil. So I essentially just looked at the ones that also export crude oil, because that's the question of this bottleneck in the value chain. We want to look at the crude oil export capacity, and we want to look at how much of that export capacity has been taken out. And based on the relevance, in the next slide, you can see that I've identified all of the terminals based on the Fleet Leaks database that actually export crude oil. And what we can say is, and it takes the data in barrels per day, so I'm using always tons process because I find it easier. But so we see that there's 53 million tons of seaborne capacity, because export terminals are for seaborne exports, not pipelines. And from this database here, I've marked in red all of the ones that have already been hit. And so we see that there's been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 oil export terminals that have been hit. And when I compare this to the video I made about the oil refineries, that's actually not a lot. There's 3, 7, 9 hits in total on the oil export capacity, and that capacity is a 33% share of the total crude oil export capacity of Russia's. I've marked in gray all the ones that are too far away for Ukraine to hit. For example, in the Sea of Japan, in the Barents Sea, in the Arctic, in the White Sea. These are all export terminals that I do not believe Ukraine currently has the ability of reliably taking out. But what really surprises me is there's actually a lot of oil export terminals that are very well within reach of Ukraine's. For example, the first one, the CPC Marine Terminal, which is worth 19% of total crude oil export capacity, it has not been hit. They attempted to hit it, but it has not been hit. They just hit the office. So that's a major target which has never been hit. The Primorsk one has been hit twice, Ust-Luga once, and then we see Novorossiysk, Sheshkaris has never been hit either. And then when we go down the list, I think that there's a lot of these oil export terminals that have never been hit. And when we look at them from a map perspective, I've put them here on the next map, and I've marked in purple those two major ones, which are the CPC terminal and the Primorsk terminal. Number 1 is the CPC one, and number 2 is the Primorsk terminal. And it is surprising then to know that the CPC one has not really been hit yet. If my data is accurate, please, if someone has a database that has a better listing of these oil export terminals which have and have not been hit, share below in the comments. I need to get that data, because it's actually quite hard to find all of these hits. But when we look at this map, there's a huge clustering at the Black Sea, and when we look at the ones that were hit, there's only one that I found that was hit at the Black Sea, and that's super surprising to me. I know they've attempted hits on the number 1 and another one down there, but I do not count those as hits. I do not count those as hits based on what I could read. Surprisingly, they did hit the ones near St. Petersburg, and they have hit the ones at the Caspian Sea, but they've been very unsuccessful at hitting those Black Sea oil export terminals. But still, with the ones that they hit in the recent campaigns, that's still 33% of the crude oil export capacity. And I still think that as a percentage is a very impressive percentage which rivals the oil refinery capacity that's been taken out recently, which was 29%. So this number is actually higher if you would apply the same logic and say it's been hit, it's out of action for at least 1 or 2 months. Then 33% of the capacity has been taken out. And that's still impressive, although it's also as impressive that so many of the Black Sea oil export terminals have not been hit. And so you guys know where I'm getting at. I need to apply that percentage to the oil value chain. But before I do that, I need to know how much of the crude oil can be exported through pipelines, which is not really hittable. And so here I've gotten some data on the main pipelines that go out of Russia. And we have the European one, which is called the Druzhba pipeline. And we see that some countries are still importing from Russia, and those are namely Slovakia, Czechia, Hungary. And those 3 countries account for approximately 1.5 million tons of oil. We see that the Atasu Alanshanku, that pipeline accounts for approximately 1.7 million. I'm counting per month, tons per month. Yeah, I'm sorry. Because we're taking a localized time view perspective, I'm translating everything to per month. And then finally, the largest one, which is in use, because the European one is not going to come back up, right? The largest one is the Espoo pipeline going to China. That one is currently exporting 2.6 million tons per month, but it has a capacity of 6.6 million per month based on that capacity in the screenshot above. So it's highly underutilized it's approximately at 40% utilization rate of the total. And so let's now apply all of those new percentages that we've discovered onto the oil value chain, and let's see what happens and where the bottlenecks break. So we've now identified the oil export terminal capacity per annum. We've identified where these oil export terminals are. We've identified which ones have been knocked out and what percentage of the total oil export terminals capacity that is. And finally, we've identified the export capacity through pipelines. And so if we look at this next slide, it's the expansion on the oil refinery bombing campaign, but while adding the oil export terminal bombing campaign. So number 1, we know that the oil refining capacity is 27 million tons per month. We know that 29% has been knocked out. So that reduces that capacity to 19 million tons per month. The difference between 27 and 19 is 8 million. That 8 million can no longer get refined, and so gets pushed upstream straight to the oil export terminals. And we know that is an increase of approximately 100% on what used to be exported automatically as crude oil. And so that total is 8 million plus 8 million. So now 16 million tons of oil is exported straight away through the crude oil export terminals. On number 2, we're at the export terminal area. We've identified the per annum export terminal capacity. However, we've also just identified that 33% has gotten knocked out. This brings down that capacity to 3 million tons per month. And then going to number 3, on the left side of the slide, in an ideal scenario, Russia is going to try to sell as much of the oil as it can. So it will try to cap out its capacity everywhere. And we've identified the Druzhba, Espoo, and AA pipelines, which equates to approximately 10 million tons per month that Russia can use those pipelines to export out from that 16 million tons. So removing the 10 million, that leaves us with 6 million. And now we're at number 4. Of that 6 million, all of that cannot go through the pipelines because the pipelines are completely full. So it all needs to go through the crude oil export terminals for shipborne exports. However, we just found out that has a capacity of 3 million per month. So this leaves us 6 million minus 3 million with an excess tonnage of 3 million, which it cannot export either through pipelines nor through the oil export terminals. And so the key question is now, what will Russia do with that excess oil? How many months will it have this excess oil, and how will it dump it, and where will it be able to dump it? So now that we've applied both the oil refinery bombing campaign and the oil export bombing campaign, we can continue those sequential consequences where we stopped last time after the oil refinery bombing campaign. And so we can say that Russia is going to have to flood the market of the oil it cannot refine anymore with crude oil via the pipelines and via the sea. However, due to the bottlenecks on the crude oil export terminal area, it has an excess of 3 million tons of waste oil, which it cannot get rid of. So one of the solutions is number 6. Instead of wasting that oil, Russia can shut down those oil wells upstream where it's pumping out the crude oil. But doing this will have long-term consequences. When you shut down an oil well during the winter, it freezes, it damages, and it's not easy to open them up. And it would likely not be possible to open them up until after the war. And so this results in a long-term loss in revenues for Russia. So it's a very difficult decision to make. And it might be possible that Russia thinks it's more profitable to just waste the oil and keep the oil wells pumping. So throw the oil away somewhere, dump it somewhere, as opposed to shutting the oil well down. And then number 7, what it can also do, and what it will definitely do, is desperate to sell all of its excess oil. So all of that oil, instead of dumping it somewhere, it tries desperately to find a buyer or tries desperately to find a way to export it. And this will also result in pricing loss due to the value of that oil reducing because it's essentially sold at dumping prices. And so these 3 additional sequential consequences due to the oil export terminal bombing campaign will result in a flooding of the market with crude oil, which will result in a lowering of the price of that same crude oil, which therefore also results in lower revenues of that crude oil, and or long-term consequences if Russia decides to shut down its oil wells. And so the key question now is, who actually wants to buy all of that excess crude oil? Does Russia have a buyer? Because all of these sequential consequences are only possible if Russia actually manages to sell all of that oil through those pipelines to China, through that ESPO pipeline, which we know has never been at max capacity. It's been even less than max capacity. So let's take a look on that side of the equation. And when we look at the recent headlines or the recent news headlines in that area, I think that the answer is quite clear. No, there are no major inclinations by China or India to buy up all of that excess oil, not because they don't want to, but because the US and the EU have rolled out a huge new set of sanctions, which are sanctions that they will set on any purchaser of Russian crude. And so as a result of this, and I've added some of the headlines here, we can see that both India and China are planning to cut their purchases of Russian crude oil as opposed to increase their purchases of Russian crude oil, which is what one would expect when crude is being offered at lower prices. You would expect more people to want to buy it, but no, the fear of the sanctions is higher than the willingness to buy despite the lower prices. And so based at least on these headlines, right now it seems like India and China are saying no to that Russian crude oil. In fact, they're lowering the amount of crude that they're willing to buy as opposed to the previous years throughout the war. So what are the key conclusions? Well, we can say that the oil exports, based on my analysis, are definitely the second most valuable target. We can see that the shutting down of several oil refineries has forced oil upstream towards the oil export terminals, and as such, a bombing campaign on those oil export terminals does make sense. Russia is forced to sell its oil as crude and not as premium refined products. However, at the same time, it's losing its buyers on the other side. So China and India, we would have expected they're going to buy up all of that excess crude. Well, that's no longer the case. And this is a key factor. These sanctions are having a huge impact if they actually stand that way. And so what we can definitely say is that, first of all, what surprised me is that many of the oil export terminals which are in reach of Ukraine have not actually been hit or wiped off the map. In particular, that cluster around the Black Sea, we know that they've made attempts, but not successfully. However, I do say it is a successful campaign, as long as the campaign in general is running. As soon as the oil refinery campaign would be to stop and Russia is able to repair its refineries, then the bottlenecks sort of also free up on the export side, right? Because all of that excess oil is going back to the refineries. And then finally, that key piece of the puzzle, those sanctions on China and India. Right now, they've made large announcements that they won't be buying that crude. But we can also see how the world has worked in the past few years. There will be ways in which they can still buy that crude through, for example, third parties, through countries or entities that are not afraid of those sanctions from the US and the EU. They will be purchasing that Russian crude at discounted pricing and resell it to India and China. But then on paper, India and China can say, no, we did not buy that oil from Russia. That's my expectation. I expect that those sanctions will be bypassed in one way or another. But that's only my opinion. Let's see what happens in reality. Thank you very much for having watched my video. These videos take a lot of work, a lot of time to make, to film, to research. So if you like the video, please don't forget to leave a like, a comment, a subscribe, or a share. And so taking a look at the channel updates, we've risen from 589 subscribers to 598 subscribers. That's 9 subscribers more than last time. That's 2% growth. I think that's okay. Not huge numbers though. In terms of future video topic ideas, this was the oil export terminals video that I announced in one of my previous videos. I know you guys love all of these oil videos and I hope you like this one too. I also did the Russia's foreign military bases video, and we still have 2 potential upcoming videos, one of which I just added. I would like to take a look also potentially at the Venezuela war. Will there be a war in Venezuela between Venezuela and the US? And so below you see some slides from my Russia's foreign military bases presence video. Do take a look at that one. I look at where Russia is expanding or decreasing its foreign military presence. And if you really liked my video and really like my channel, and I'm not a monetized channel, so if you want to support me even more, I have published some books. They're available on Amazon. One of them is called AI Revolution. The other is called 3 Lives. It's a World War II fiction book. The other is an AI sort of sci-fi book. So do take a look at that and buy it if you want to support me. And thank you so much for your attention.